The golden age of America begins right now.
Starting on day one, we will defeat inflation quickly and we will make America affordable again.
We will be the envy of every nation. I will very simply put America first.
One year ago, Donald Trump took to the stage in the East Room of the White House, setting out his vision for a new, better America. One which, in his words, would put America first. The following 12 months saw nearly every conventional rule in the book be ripped up, from placing a 10% tariff on an uninhabited island of penguins, meeting with the most sanctioned man on the planet, and now invading the country with the world's largest oil reserves. But while this is undoubtedly good for newsrooms, how have his policies affected the world? And most importantly, the very Americans who voted for him? Given how fast things move, and Trump's habit of changing his mind, it's easy to lose track of what he promised to do and what actually ended up happening. But despite the theatrics, he was actually elected on a surprisingly firm set of pledges, even if many of them were, at times, wildly ambitious. On the campaign trail, he promised sweeping changes, things like clamping down on illegal immigration, ending the war in Ukraine, and finally getting America's ballooning government debt under control. But not all of these promises have materialised. Just a few months in, the much-typed DOGE department, which was supposed to bring down debt, was shut down. And outside of COVID, the US is now recording the largest budget deficit in its history. On the other hand, he's been remarkably successful at cutting immigration, something which many commentators regarded as impossible. Regardless of where you stand politically, there's no denying he's one of the most unpredictable presidents in generations, and one who could end up shaping the world for decades to come. This is 1 year of Donald Trump's economy explained. To judge how well Trump has performed, we first need to be clear about what exactly he set out to do, and then measure him against those goals. And that's harder than it sounds. Trump is one of the most divisive figures on the planet, and regardless of the conclusion you reach, half the audience will already disagree. He's also one of the most hyperbolic leaders in modern politics, which raises a key question. Do you judge him by what he says, or by what he's realistically trying to achieve? With all of that in mind, let's take a look at his first year. Throughout his campaign, Trump has made one thing clear. His priority would be putting America first. In practice, this really revolved around four things: getting prices down, bringing back American jobs, reducing immigration, and reasserting US power on the international stage. Each of these have shaped his first year in office in very different ways, and while foreign policy may have dominated the headlines, in the minds of the American public, especially heading into the 2024 election, one issue towered above all others: prices. By the start of 2024, affordability had become the single most important concern for voters. And to be fair, there was a very real reason for that. In the 4 years leading up to the election, the value of the dollar had shrunk by nearly 20%. While the Biden administration ultimately bore the brunt of that blame, the roots of the problem stretch back a little further. During the COVID pandemic, the government printed huge amounts of money, which was then injected straight into the economy through stimulus checks, all in an effort to keep the economy moving. At the time, this seemed like the only viable option. The country had effectively been put into an induced coma. Businesses were closed by law, so tens of millions were out of work overnight, and without intervention there was a real risk of full-scale economic depression. So the government ended up increasing the total amount of money in the economy by nearly 30%. Unsurprisingly, this caused huge amounts of inflation in the years that followed, and over the course of his presidency, Biden saw prices rise by a fifth across the board, the highest level of inflation seen in a generation. Now, it's worth mentioning that this was mostly out of his control. Decisions around money printing are taken by the Federal Reserve, which is totally independent from the president. But the Trump campaign didn't pay much attention to that detail. He hammered the issue relentlessly, blaming Bidenflation for destroying the dollar, promising to slash prices on everything from groceries to gasoline. This gave him a critical edge. By the time of the election, polling consistently showed inflation and the cost of living to be the voters' most important issue. And on this, they tended to favour Trump, with him coming out 13% higher when voters were asked about who would do a good job bringing down prices. That alone might have not been enough to make all the difference, but among swing voters, the gap was enormous. there were 37% more confident in Trump than Kamala when it came to tackling this issue. And in an election decided on razor-thin margins across a handful of states, that advantage was essential. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Until not too long ago, I was doing most of the work on these videos by myself. But thanks to your support, we now have a full team of researchers working round the clock to make these videos possible. If you're a business owner, you know exactly all the things that come with it, but everything that you can dream of one day needing is on Odoo. It's an all-in-one business management platform offering over 45 apps to help you manage your business. But the one I want to highlight today is their invoicing app. With Odoo, you can create and send invoices in seconds. Just select your customer, add your products or service, set quantities, set the billing terms, and send it directly by email, all from one place. And let clients pay online through the customer portal using their preferred payment method like Stripe, PayPal, or other methods. And if you connect your bank, Odoo automatically updates in real time the payment status, so you always know what's been paid and what's still pending. With Odoo's first app free for life plan, you can start using Odoo's invoicing app completely for free, including unlimited hosting and support. Try it today using the link in the pinned comment or description. For millions of voters struggling to afford rent, groceries, and fuel, the promise to bring prices down was the reason they turned out, and in the end, the reason Trump won. But as powerful as affordability can be when it comes to campaigning, in government it can actually be something of a curse. When economists talk about price increases, they normally refer to inflation, which is the amount which prices are increasing every year. And on this front, Trump has actually done a fairly good job. Since the start of his term, inflation has been fairly stable at around 2.8% per year, slightly above the official target of 2%, but still a far better record than what Biden achieved. But while this might be satisfying for economists, for actual voters it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. After all, when everyday people are thinking about price increases, they generally aren't just thinking about what happened in the last 12 months, but the past few years. In the minds of the public, Trump's promise to end inflation wasn't him saying that he'd get inflation down to normal levels, but that he'd bring prices back to where they were before the COVID pandemic. And on that front, he's totally failed. Eggs are still up more than 40% compared to their pre-pandemic level, bread around 30%, and meat prices roughly 20% on average. Prices overall are around 25% higher now than they were before the pandemic. And in voters' eyes, this is starting to become a major broken promise. By December, 58% of Americans disapproved of Trump's handling of the economy, while just 33% believed he was doing a good job, his lowest approval rating on the economy since the start of his presidency. That might make it sound like when it comes to prices and inflation, he's been a total failure, but that wouldn't necessarily be a fair assessment. While public perception has steadily worsened, the underlying economic data tells a far more complicated and far less intuitive story. Since 2024, real wages, that is, the wage growth that's left after you account for increases in prices, has been rising steadily. That means, on paper, the typical American worker is better off now than they were before the inflation surge, continuing a trend that goes well back into the Biden years. Of course, some things like electricity and housing have risen far faster than wages, and those are typically the goods that dominate headlines. But on average, life in America has never been more affordable, even for those on the lowest incomes. In fact, it's actually the bottom 10% of wage earners who saw their pay, adjusted for inflation, increase the fastest. That might sound like a bit of a contradiction. Why would affordability still be the number one issue in American politics? The answer lies less in the economic realities of the country and more in the psychology of the people that occupy it. Surveys conducted by Harvard economists found that people tend to ascribe price rises to forces completely outside their control. Greedy corporations, government incompetence, or global crises. But when their wages rise, they see it very differently. These increases are often attributed to their own hard work, skill, or professional competence. In other words, when people get paid more, they feel like they've earned it, whereas when price increases, it feels distinctly unfair, even if both of those things are being caused by the same inflation. That's why affordability has become such a dominant political force, even at a time where, by the numbers, Americans are better off than ever. Unfortunately for Trump, there really isn't much he can do about this, regardless of how strong the economy is. Prices are unlikely to ever come back down to their pre-pandemic levels. It's a classic case of promising the impossible and setting himself up for a failure. Now, while Trump isn't necessarily to blame for the psychological realities at play here, he might be making the situation even worse. At the start of 2026, he announced that he would pursue criminal charges against the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. His justification was that Powell had lied to Congress about the cost of some office renovations at the Fed. But just days later, Powell released a video in which he basically accused Trump of trying to arrest him because he refused to cut interest rates like the president had asked. And to be fair, Trump himself has said that anybody who disagrees with him would never be the Fed chair. But even if Trump doesn't remove Powell outright, his term is up in May 2026, and at that point, Trump would be free to appoint a replacement who agrees with him on virtually everything, including the need to aggressively cut interest rates. It's easy to see why Trump is so keen on this approach. The US national debt has now exceeded $38 trillion, more than $110,000 per citizen, and the interest on this debt alone is now set to cost the government more than $1 trillion every year, more than the country's enormous military budget. And despite all the promises to do the opposite, Trump's first year saw the government debt grow at one of the fastest rates in the country's history. Of course, as the amount of money the US owes grow, the cost of paying interest will only continue to rise. That is, unless the government is able to cut interest rates. A reduction of rates on the national debt by 2% would give the government hundreds of billions extra to spend each year, and at the same time, cutting interest rates makes it easier for businesses and consumers alike to borrow money. That means cheaper mortgages, more debt finance spending, and crucially, higher levels of business investment. In theory, that would create something of an economic boom. But as tempting as this might sound, the truth is that cutting interest rates as aggressively as Trump wants to do would be crippling for the economy. While it might stimulate the economy in the short term, one country can only produce so much. And when too much money starts chasing too few goods, prices inevitably end up rising. There's a good chance that if Trump fully goes for this policy, it would end up recreating the very inflation that he elected to reverse. We're already seeing the early signs of this, and the prices of assets like gold and silver have exploded as investors try to hedge their bets against the dollar losing value. But even if Trump never actually follows through on cutting interest rates, the uncertainty alone is still damaging. When banks can't confidently predict what the dollar will be worth in the future, they end up charging higher interest rates on the loans they give out to consumers and businesses to compensate for that extra risk. In a strange way, Trump's commitment to cutting interest rates might actually be driving them even higher. Of course, it's not like this somewhat chaotic approach is anything new to the Trump administration. It's easy to forget now, but when Trump first announced his so-called Liberation Day tariffs, it looked like the US might actually slip into an entirely self-induced recession. Within a couple of days, the stock market has slid by 12%, the biggest drop since the pandemic. And at the time, economists almost universally warned that this would drive inflation, and they had good reason to think so. Simply put, tariffs operate as a tax on foreign goods, and like any extra cost, they tend to drive up prices. Of course, in the short term, companies can sometimes absorb the cost by accepting lower profits, but the industries most exposed, agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and basic industrial goods, typically run on margins well under 10%, leaving little room to sustainably absorb higher costs. Over time, they're left with little choice but to raise prices. On paper, that argument sounds convincing, especially with decades of economic theory backing it up. But in practice, the reality has been far more complicated. Most of the predictions about how the tariffs would actually drive prices up, even higher, have simply not played out. At least not in the way that most experts expected. Since Liberation Day, consumer price growth has remained more or less stable. And even more surprisingly, import prices haven't increased at all. Exactly the opposite of what most economic models would have predicted. At the same time, the tariffs have generated hundreds of billions of dollars in extra tax revenue for the US government, allowing them to cut things like taxes on tips and overtime pay. That might make tariffs sound like an unexpected success, but that doesn't quite tell the whole story. A big reason why prices haven't surged is that following the Liberation Day chaos, most of the planned tariffs were quietly scrapped. The effective tariff rate today has ended up being less than half of what it was originally announced to be. It's a classic case of Trump talking big and eventually being forced to walk things back. And of the tariffs that were implemented, they don't quite work the way that they were sold. Despite promises that foreign countries would pay, around 60% of the cost of the tariffs has fallen on American businesses. That might not be such a bad thing for consumers. After all, it means that the increase in prices haven't been fully passed on, at least for now. But it makes it a lot harder for him to deliver another one of his key campaign promises: bringing jobs back to America. Over the past few decades, the flood of Chinese exports into the US wiped out millions of American jobs, particularly in manufacturing. Unsurprisingly, the same areas became some of Trump's strongest bases of support. Research consistently shows that communities most exposed to Chinese import competition were far more likely to back him at the ballot box. And tariffs were meant to be the solution, a way to force production back onto US soil and reverse decades of industrial decline. But on this front, they seem to have totally failed. The number of jobs in manufacturing in the US has actually slightly declined since the tariffs were first announced. Part of that is because so much of the tariffs were rolled back, and it often remained cheaper for companies to keep production overseas and simply pay the additional tax rather than absorb the far higher costs of relocating factories back to the US. But there's also a much bigger factor at play here. Because tariffs make importing raw materials that are used for production more expensive, firms are often forced to lay off workers in other industries. So while tariffs do create small gains for protected companies, this tends to be offset by job losses elsewhere. The result is that the overall impact of tariffs in sectors like manufacturing is often actually negative, which is exactly what we are seeing today. The point is, it doesn't seem like the tariffs have had any positive impact on the American economy, even if a lot of the predicted dangers never fully materialized. With that said, it would still be a mistake to say that they've been completely inconsequential. While they might have failed to bring back American jobs, they did manage to send the rest of the world into something of a crisis. Faced with the sudden threat of losing access to the world's largest consumer market, countries found themselves lining up to lobby Washington for special treatment, creating some pretty ludicrous headlines in the process. Switzerland gifted Trump a gold bar worth $130,000, with his initials engraved on the top. But this was quickly one-upped by Qatar, who donated him a $400 million private jet, flush with over 40 televisions and gold-plated interiors. Of course, none of this was purely ceremonial. Instead, it was all part of a broader effort to gain leverage in trade negotiations and secure exemptions from US tariffs. From the perspective of the US, it's not a bad position to be in. Canada quickly matched tariff exemptions, ultimately signing an agreement which gave significant concessions designed to favour US manufacturers. Similarly, the UK agreed a trade deal that saw US tariffs on British steel and cars cut substantially, while the UK offered lower tariff rates and expanded market access for American goods. In purely transactional terms, tariffs gave Washington bargaining power it hasn't exercised so bluntly in decades. All of this was part of Trump's broader effort to put the United States first, and to be fair, that's one promise he genuinely seems committed to pursuing. On the international stage, he's shown little hesitation in criticising, pressuring, or sidelining traditional allies if it meant protecting the interests of the world's dominant superpower. All again under the guise of America first. But whether this unconventional approach to foreign policy has been successful is another question entirely. After Zelensky's first state visit, many assumed American support for Ukraine was about to collapse. What was meant to be a show of unity quickly turned into a public spectacle. Trump openly criticised Zelensky, saying he didn't have the cards and was in no position to make demands all in front of the press. But just a few months later, it was as if none of that had happened. Trump met Zelensky again, this time at Mar-a-Lago, and struck a completely different tone, privately promising that the US would continue supporting Ukraine in the war. This kind of volatility from the most powerful person in the world is deeply unsettling for American allies, and in recent history it's almost unprecedented. But as chaotic as it looks, there may be some method to it. In foreign policy, especially around conflict, predictability matters a huge amount. In cases like Taiwan, China's decision to invade wouldn't just depend on its own capabilities, but whether it believes the US would intervene. The problem is, with someone like Trump in charge, predicting how he would react seems almost impossible. That's exactly what we saw happen in Venezuela with the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Washington's messaging around the invasion had shifted repeatedly, leaving regional powers unsure as to what the long-term aims of the US actually are. That uncertainty acts as a huge deterrent for other countries to get involved, as they have literally no idea how America would respond. Typically, these kind of foreign policy decisions, along with the economy, end up being the two single most defining features of a presidency. But in Trump's case, there is a third factor, one which might end up being his most significant legacy: his promise to cut migration. In the 4 years prior to getting elected, the levels of migration, particularly illegal, in the United States have exploded. Of course, Trump has already built his reputation as an immigration hardliner during his first term. So as immigration quietly became one of the most important issues in American politics, it's no surprise that this massively favoured Trump. And to be fair, of all the promises he's made, this is one area where, at least in terms of achieving the goal he's set out to, it's been an undeniable success. Since coming into power, the levels of measured illegal immigration have plummeted to the lowest level since records began. This is in large part thanks to the new powers granted to the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE. Prior to Trump's term, the organisation operated in tight legal constraints, effectively making it very difficult for them to actually arrest and deport people who had illegally crossed the border. People knew that if they managed to cross the border into the US, they were basically free to stay there. But under Trump, these legal protections have been massively scaled back. ICE now effectively operates almost entirely above the law, and at the same time, within his first year, they saw their annual budget jump by over 400%. Unsurprisingly, this has generated massive controversy. Scenes began circling across social media of masked federal agents conducting raids in workplaces and residential neighborhoods. This has created a strange dynamic where, despite the fact that he's technically achieved what he promised to do, stop illegal migration, it's become increasingly unpopular as a thing to support. Recent polling found that only 38% of Americans support deporting all illegal immigrants, down from 47% at the time of the election. And it's not just that the perceived harshness of enforcement that's driving the shift. There's also growing economic consequences. Large-scale deportations reduce the amount of people to work, particularly in industries like agriculture, construction, food processing, and hospitality. As workers become scarcer, wages in those sectors start to rise. At first glance, that sounds like a win, and for the people who are looking for jobs in those areas, it probably is. One person's wage is another person's cost. As wages in agriculture and manufacturing rise, businesses will end up charging higher prices to consumers to cover their rising costs. So most Americans end up paying for those higher wages through more expensive food, housing, and everyday goods, something which they specifically voted to try and avoid. Ultimately, Trump's first year looks more like a series of trade-offs than clear wins or losses. On the cost of living, inflation has stabilised and wages have continued to rise, but by promising to actively reverse price increases, he set expectations that were never realistic. So despite relatively solid economic data, the public increasingly view this as a massive failure. At the same time, tariffs were central to his promise of reviving American manufacturing. Yet they were largely rolled back, and even where implemented, failed to deliver meaningful job growth. Internationally, his controversial and unpredictable style has unsettled allies, but it also restored a degree of US leverage, forcing concessions and reshaping negotiations. In many ways, it's simply too early to tell what the results of this strategy in this area will be. But of all the areas that he campaigned on, immigration is clearly the biggest example of success. Illegal crossings have fallen sharply, and enforcement has been expanded dramatically. Yet that success has come at a political cost. It's not clear that the public even supports this police anymore, despite how they felt during the election. In the end, Trump, like any president, has achieved some of what he promised, but fallen far short of what most people said he'd achieve during the campaign. In the process, he's created a country deeply divided in what's becoming a presidency less defined by outcomes and more by constant rhetorical escalation.